As a bitter winter storm rages, reclusive veteran Daniel Clayton offers refuge to the desperate Jesse Turner and his family, stranded and forgotten. Against the judgment of his community and the concern of his own children, Daniel quietly sacrifices his life savings to ensure their survival, embodying his profound code of honor. But a deeper shared history soon emerges from the cold. Jesse, burdened by years of silent guilt, reveals his role in a tragic ambush and his perceived failure to his commanding officer, Colonel David Garner. What Jesse doesn't know is Daniel's own life was saved by that very same colonel decades ago. This incredible connection sets the stage for an unexpected and powerful reckoning. If this powerful story of compassion and redemption touched your heart, please show your support. Give this video a like, subscribe to our channel for more inspiring true stories, and share it with someone who believes in the quiet power of goodness. Your support helps us share these vital messages. The bitter voice of Daniel, the neighbor, sliced through the freezing air. "Turning your place into a shelter now?" he sneered. But Daniel Clayton didn't rise to the bait. He stood unmoving, silent, his gaze fixed on the wind as it swept across his snow-dusted land. Behind him, near the old barn, a family gathered tightly, shivering beneath coats too thin for the cold, their eyes sunken with exhaustion, and a baby's cough rasping weakly through the winter stillness. All they had to their name was a van on the verge of collapse and a folded military uniform no one in this town had cared to honor. Then came the low hum, engines growing louder by the second. Daniel turned his head slightly as the sound broke through the mist. 3 black SUVs rolled up the road, flanked by military trucks that came to a halt at his front gate. Their doors opened all at once with choreographed precision, and soldiers stepped out in a full-dress uniform. They moved into a solemn formation, the precision and reverence unmistakable. The same neighbors who had laughed earlier now fell into stunned silence, mouths open, unsure of what to say. This wasn't a social visit. This wasn't ceremony for the living. They had come for someone this town had long since forgotten. Daniel Clayton wasn't the kind of man who sought the spotlight. He never raised his voice unless he was calling the sheep down from the hills or warning the local kids to steer clear of the frozen pond in winter. At 70, his steps were slow, but they carried the weight of purpose, the kind earned through decades of ranching and 23 years in military uniform. His hands were thick with calluses, his back straight but stiff from time and toil, and his eyes, those sharp hazel eyes, had once stared down the swirling sandstorms of Iraq. Now they watched over the quiet expanse of his eastern Oregon ranch with the vigilance of a man who had nothing left to protect but everything to remember. Sergeant First Class, retired. U.S. Army, a man who had served faithfully but spoke little of it. The medals tucked away in a cedar chest upstairs whispered of battles survived and courage tested, though no one had dared ask him to relive them. He had buried his military life beneath layers of flannel, worn boots, in the steady rhythm of tending sheep. After the war, he didn't look back, not until life forced him to. 6 years earlier, he lost Margaret, his wife of 44 years, the only one who knew every hidden scar, every ghost. She had been his compass, his calm in the storm, and her slow death from cancer had hollowed him out. When the final silence fell across their modest farmhouse, Daniel wasn't just left alone. He was unmoored, adrift. A year later came the heart surgery. It didn't just take a toll on his body. It nearly wiped out his savings and decimated his flock. What had once been a herd of 300 sheep roaming 90 acres was now just 40, kept not for income, but for the comfort of habit. They gave his morning structure and his nights a sense of continuity. Life had been stripped down to the essentials. His pension checks came like clockwork on the 3rd of every month. He bought groceries every other Friday. A single black and white photo of Margaret sat near the stove, and each evening, Daniel spoke to it. Sometimes it was a joke, sometimes a shared memory, sometimes just a soft, "Good night, Maggie," spoken to the quiet. The townspeople respected him, though they never quite understood him. He didn't attend church, he didn't linger in diners or chat at the feed store. But if someone's roof had blown off in a storm, or their cattle needed to be moved to higher ground before the flood, Daniel showed up without fanfare, his old Ford rattling up the drive, a tool belt on his hip, and a thermos of black coffee in hand. He was seen as quiet, old-fashioned, maybe even a bit stubborn when it came to what was right and what was not. He never helped others for attention. He didn't care about social media posts or being seen doing good. To Daniel, honor wasn't something you wore on your sleeve. It was how you treated others when there was no one watching. And that's precisely what made the moment so striking. Because when a man like Daniel Clayton, who had spent a lifetime burying his past and quietly doing right, finally decided to stand up for someone everyone else had passed by, the world was forced to take notice, especially when the uniform that returned to his land didn't come back alone. It was late afternoon when the air shifted. Daniel, who knew the land better than most, didn't need to check the sky to feel the storm coming. He sensed it in the stillness of the trees, the hush in the wind. The clouds remained pale for now, but the air was charged, sharp and tingling. Snow would be coming hard and fast within the hour. He had just come in from inspecting the barn roof, wiping his hands on an old cloth when he heard it, the sputtering gasp of an engine struggling for life. He stepped out onto the porch, squinting into the distance beyond the tree line. There, cutting through the curtain of white, a battered minivan limped into view. It was rusted, sagging to one side. The engine wheezed like an exhausted mule as it struggled down the gravel drive, tires skidding over the fresh coat of snow. It barely made it 50 feet past the gate before it sputtered, gave a final shuddering rattle, and went completely still. Silence followed, broken only by the hiss of steam curling out from under the hood. A long creak signaled the car door opening. A man stepped out and steadied himself against the biting wind. He was tall, unshaven, draped in a military surplus jacket that hung off him like borrowed skin, several sizes too large. His boots were scuffed down to the stitching, and though his eyes stayed sharp, they were hollowed in a way that had nothing to do with laziness or addiction. Daniel Clayton had seen those kinds of eyes before. This was something else, something heavier. This was the look of a man who had run out of rope, who had tried every path and still ended up lost. "Afternoon," Daniel called out, his voice calm and deliberate. He stood firm on his porch, reading the man the way a farmer reads the sky before a storm. The stranger raised a hand in cautious greeting. "Sorry to just show up," he said, voice raspy with cold and weariness. "We've been on the road 3 days, came up from Kansas." He paused, his breath visible in the winter air. "Car's done. No heat, no gas, no food. Just looking for somewhere warm for my family while I figure out a way to get it fixed." The passenger side door opened, and a woman emerged, clutching a bundled infant tight to her chest. The baby was wrapped in a thin, fraying blanket. 2 more children climbed out after her. A girl around 8, a boy perhaps 6. Both looked underfed, cheeks raw from the cold, their small hands gripping their mother's coat for warmth and security. Daniel descended the porch steps slowly. The cold gnawed at his knees, but he didn't hurry. His eyes never left the man, watching how he positioned himself between his family and the world. Protective, watchful, reflexes of someone trained to expect danger. Combat wired. That kind of posture didn't fade easily. "What's your name?" Daniel asked, halting a few feet away. "Jesse Turner," the man replied. 82nd Airborne, 2 tours in Afghanistan." Daniel gave a slight nod, just once. "Clayton, Sergeant First Class, Desert Storm." And that was all the introduction either of them needed. In the silence that followed, more was said than words could carry. Daniel's gaze shifted to the children. The baby coughed again, dry and sharp, and the mother's arms drew in tighter, instinctively shielding the child from a world that had already given them too little. "I've got an old bunkhouse out back," Daniel said after a beat. "It's rough, but there's a stove. It'll keep the wind out." Jesse blinked, stunned. "Sir, we don't have any way to pay." "I didn't ask for money," Daniel cut in, already turning toward the barn. "Get your family out of this cold." A few minutes later, Daniel was hauling an armload of firewood across the yard while Jesse carried the baby through the open bunkhouse door. Neither man asked for an explanation. There was no need, just 2 veterans, different wars, same code. For Jesse Turner, who had become used to rejection and locked doors, this small act of humanity felt nearly impossible. And yet, it was real, and it was warm. The bunkhouse hadn't seen life in years. A single-room cabin tucked behind the barn, built by Daniel's father back in the 60s as a place for hired hands to rest during lambing season. The roof sagged but held. The stove moaned but still took a flame. That was enough. Daniel swept the dust and cobwebs himself while Jesse quietly unloaded their meager belongings, a weathered duffel of clothes, a tin of baby formula, and a folded American flag. No complaints, no demands, just quiet, aching gratitude. By the time the sun dipped behind the trees, a thin ribbon of smoke curled up from the stovepipe. Inside, the children sat close to the heat, their mother spooning out bowls of soup that Daniel had made from scratch. The baby had finally fallen asleep, her cough easing in the warmth. Jesse offered to help, said he'd mend the broken fence out back. Daniel just shook his head. Rest. The next morning, Daniel drove into town. He stopped first at the feed store, filling his truck with sacks of grain and bales of hay. Then he went on to the general store and bought everything he thought the family might need. Boots and coats for all of them, diapers, medicine, canned food, a space heater, and even a little red sled for the children. He picked out a pair of wool gloves, small enough to fit a boy's hands. And finally, he stopped at the bank. All of it? The teller asked, staring at the withdrawal slip with raised brows. That's your whole savings, Mr. Clayton. Daniel nodded as he signed the form. Can't take it with me. By the time he returned to town, whispers had already begun. Rumors grew quick in small places. At the gas station, Frank from the ranch next door leaned out his window. You housing transients now? Daniel didn't reply. He'd already put the truck in reverse and was backing out. That afternoon, he began unloading the supplies in front of the bunkhouse. The wind bit at his neck, but he worked without pause. From the road, he heard the crunch of tires over packed snow. His daughter's car. She'd come fast. Concern made her punctual. Rebecca stepped out first, 42, sharp-voiced and pragmatic. A middle school principal, sensible, steady, and behind her came Michael. Was always the careful one, buttoned up, deliberate, the kind of man who checked the thermostat twice before leaving the house. A man of routine and risk calculation, he made his living in insurance. So when Rebecca, standing with arms crossed, barked, "Dad," her eyes narrowing as she caught sight of Jesse out in the cold, shirtless, and swinging an axe into thick logs, her voice was sharp and edged with accusation. "What's going on here?" she demanded. Daniel, unbothered by her tone, handed her a pair of gloves. "They're staying in the bunkhouse," he said plainly. "The kids were half frozen when they got here." Michael's brows furrowed. "You gave them shelter?" There was something beneath his voice, skepticism, maybe fear. "And what else?" he added. "Stanley at the store said you spent $4,000 on supplies." "They needed it," Daniel replied simply, not flinching. Rebecca's expression darkened. "You barely know them." Leaning against the tailgate of his truck, Daniel shrugged, but there was nothing indifferent in the weight of his words. "I know enough. He served. He's got a family to take care of. That's already more than most folks have going for them." And Michael crossed his arms, voice low, almost tired. "You can't save everyone." "I'm not trying to," Daniel said. "Just this one family." A gust of wind surged through, rattling the eaves and whipping snow off the roof into the air like a warning. For a long moment, no one spoke. The silence wasn't peace. It was tension holding its breath. Rebecca broke it, her voice barely above the wind. "You're risking everything." Daniel nodded. "Then let it be for something that matters." They didn't argue again. But when they turned and left, the silence that lingered between them was thick, like something unresolved and weighty. Inside the bunkhouse, a sound rose that was so soft it seemed almost imagined. Laughter. Children's laughter, light and warm, the kind that came only once the shivering had stopped. To Daniel, it was worth every cent, every doubt, every risk. Later, as the snow continued to fall, Daniel sat on the porch nursing a mug of black coffee gone cold. Jesse joined him quietly, settling beside him with his own mug, steam long since faded. The wind had calmed, and for the first time in what felt like days, the sky above held a faint, fragile light. They sat in silence, two men who'd seen things they couldn't forget. Eventually Jesse spoke, eyes fixed on the frost-covered fields beyond the property. "You ever carry something so long he said slowly, that it just becomes a part of who you are, like a scar you forget about until someone brushes against it. Daniel didn't respond, didn't move. He just waited. I was discharged early, Jesse continued. Kandahar, 2013. It was supposed to be routine, a convoy inspection near an Allied outpost. I was on comms. I should have caught something. Anything. But I didn't. His voice dropped low, heavy. They hit us. An ambush. We lost our CO, Colonel David Garner. Smart guy. Steady hands. The kind of man who remembered birthdays, knew every kid's name. He'd walk point so no one else had to. Daniel set his mug down gently, as if the weight of what he was about to say required both hands free. Garner, he repeated, voice distant. Yeah, Jesse nodded. I thought I'd be court-martialed, but they just let me go. Administrative discharge, no ceremony, no handshake. Just silence. He blew out through his nose. I've been carrying that for years. Alicia tells me to stop blaming myself, but she didn't see him. I did. I was supposed to keep him alive. Daniel stared toward the far hills, his voice slow, thick with memory. Garner, he said again, softer this time. First Lieutenant David Garner. Fort Bragg. Desert Storm. Jesse turned toward him, startled. You knew him? Knew him, Daniel echoed. The edge of his mouth twitched, something caught between disbelief and grief. He saved my life outside Al-Faji in '91, pulled me out of a burning Humvee with a busted shoulder. Told me I owed him a steak dinner when we got back. Jesse blinked, as if trying to steady something inside himself. He never mentioned that. He wouldn't have, Daniel said, shaking at his head. That's just the kind of man he was. The silence that followed wasn't strained. It was something else. Reverent. A moment held between two men bound by grief and memory. You think I let him down? Jesse asked, barely above a whisper. Daniel didn't look at him. I think you're still alive, he said, which means he'd want you to do something with that. Jesse looked down into his mug, lost in the darkness of it. I've known guilt, Daniel went on. It's like a rucksack that never lightens. You think carrying it makes you stronger, but really, it just wears you down. Jesse swallowed hard, then asked the question that had lingered in his mind since the day Daniel opened his door. Why'd you take us in? Really? You didn't know any of this? No, Daniel said, I didn't. But maybe this is the debt I've been waiting to repay. Garner gave me my life. You're part of his story now. He paused, then added, and I don't leave a man behind. Not even years later. A gentle gust stirred the snow resting on the porch railing. From inside the bunkhouse, a baby coughed. And then, faint but clear, Alicia's lullaby floated into the stillness like smoke from a dying fire. And in that quiet, between the wind and the snow, and the memory of a man neither of them would ever forget, something wordless passed between them. One had carried guilt for too long. The other had carried a debt just as heavy. Now they carried each other, no longer in silence, no longer in shame. The morning started like any other, quiet and cold, wrapped in the stillness only new snow can bring. Everything was muted under its white blanket, the kind of peace that makes you forget the world can shift in an instant. Jesse was already outside before the sun peeked over Pine Ridge. He moved with quiet purpose, a shovel in hand, methodically clearing the long gravel drive. Each stroke was even and steady, not hurried, not distracted. His breath curled in soft white puffs, barely noticeable except when the light hit just right. But his mind wasn't on the snow. It was far away, stuck in a place he thought he'd buried for good. Inside the bunkhouse, morning life was beginning. The kids were waking. Alicia, wrapped in her warm robe, was gently warming formula over the old iron stove. Daniel stood on the porch like he always did, one hand holding a chipped mug of coffee, the other buried in his coat pocket. He didn't say a word. He never needed to. His silence was his own kind of wisdom, louder than lectures, firmer than advice. Then it came, the low rumble. At first it was barely noticeable, more vibration than sound. Daniel squinted toward the snowy horizon, and his hand paused with the mug halfway to his lips. The rumble deepened, building like a slow-rolling thunder that didn't belong to any storm. And then the first black SUV cut through the fog. Then a second, then a third. Behind them came two large military transport trucks, their heavy tires crunching over frozen gravel. They didn't stop at the ranch's weathered mailbox. They kept going, rolling up the driveway without hesitation, until the lead SUV came to a sharp stop just feet from where Jesse stood. He froze, still gripping the shovel, its blade half buried in the snow. The doors opened in a coordinated, almost eerie unison. From the lead vehicle stepped a tall woman in a black overcoat. Her military dress uniform, sharp and pressed beneath it, left no doubt. Yamot. She was a colonel. Her gaze swept the ranch like a scanner, measured, troned, and calm. From the second SUV, an older man emerged, slower, more deliberate. Every step he took echoed command. He bore the 4 stars of a general. Daniel quietly set his coffee cup down on the porch railing. More soldiers filed out of the remaining vehicles, forming a silent line along the driveway. Their boots were perfectly aligned, their expressions unreadable but solemn. The crisp flag patches on their sleeves flapped lightly in the cold breeze. The stillness that followed was almost reverent, surreal. Jesse rose slowly to his full height, still clutching the shovel. He didn't speak, didn't move. Alicia had stepped outside, baby Grace nestled in her arms. Emma and Thomas stood in the doorway just behind her, peeking from the edge, eyes wide and fixed on the scene unraveling in front of them. The general stepped forward. His voice was low, but it carried, strong and clear through the cold, like a steady drumbeat. "Sergeant Jesse Turner," he began, "you've been carrying a weight that was never yours to bear." Jesse blinked, stunned. I don't understand, sir." The tall woman, Colonel Winters, stepped beside the general, a leather portfolio in her hands, sealed and formal. "Your letter," she said, "the one you sent to Colonel Garner's widow, it made its way up the chain." That letter led to a full review. Jesse shook his head slowly. "That letter wasn't for anyone else. I just needed her to know I was sorry." "She knew," the general said, his tone gentler now. "She also knew the truth. And now, so do we." Jesse turned, looking at the line of soldiers, the black vehicles, the flags, the perfect polish on their boots, now dusted with snow, and his knees wavered. The truth was finally staring back at him. Daniel was at his side in an instant, gripping his arm to steady him. "Easy, son," he murmured. The general turned toward the waiting trucks and nodded. "We didn't come here to shame you," he said. "We came to set the record straight." The weight of years, of war, of guilt, of unspoken regret, seemed to lift slightly in that moment. The silence that had haunted Jesse was finally breaking. The truth buried under reports and shame had come riding up his driveway in full formation. Colonel Winters opened the portfolio with practiced hands, but there was a gravity to the moment that even her experience couldn't neutralize. This wasn't a Pentagon podium or a press room. This was a snowy ranch surrounded by sheep, pine smoke curling from the chimney, and a man who had lived far too long with a wiener pressing on his soul. She handed the first document to General Harlan, who cleared his throat before reading. His voice wasn't that of a bureaucrat ticking off protocol. It was personal, heavy, and resolute. "After Colonel Garner's death," and he said, "the operation in Kandahar was sealed and buried under classified status. But recent investigations have revealed the truth. Your team received corrupted intelligence. That intel came from a compromised source, someone working directly against U.S. forces." Jesse didn't move. He didn't even seem to breathe. The world around him was holding its breath too. "It wasn't your failure," Colonel Winters added. "It was a setup. And despite that, your actions after the ambush began, calling for support, organizing the retreat, tending the wounded, those actions saved 17 American lives." The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was sacred. Alicia gasped softly, clutching Grace tighter. Daniel bowed his head, his fists clenched, his jaw locked. The general looked Jesse straight in the eye. "We're here today," he said firmly, "to correct the record." And on that frozen morning with snow in the air and truth finally uncovered, the burden Jesse had carried alone for years was lifted, not by absolution, but by recognition. Firm resolve, but from silence and forgetting, something had finally broken through. The general gave a nod to a young lieutenant who stepped forward and presented a small wooden case. With quiet reverence, he handed it to Colonel Winters. She opened the lid with deliberate care. Inside, a bronze star caught the faint winter light, its glint like a memory uncovered after too long in the dark. "This," she said steadily, her voice cutting through the still air, was recommended by your commanding officer before his death. It's been buried in a classified file all this time. Jesse stared at the metal as if unsure whether he was dreaming or awake. The light flickered in his eyes, reflecting off the metal, and he blinked slowly. I don't know what to say. You don't have to say a word, Sergeant, the general answered gently. You did your duty, and it's long past time that was recognized. Without pause, the general motioned to another aide who stood out forward, this time carrying a second case. Your discharge, he announced, has been officially upgraded to honorable. Effective immediately, retroactive benefits will be restored, including back pay, medical coverage, and full family assistance. Behind them, a convoy of soldiers began unloading crates from transport trucks. The markings on the boxes bore the seal of the military, stamped, tagged, and loaded with supplies. There were wool blankets, winter coats, boxes of food rations, medical kits, children's shoes, and jackets. All the quiet necessities that spelled survival through harsh months. We've also been working with local authorities and several nonprofits, Colonel Winters added. Your family will receive housing assistance for your relocation to Idaho. Your children are now eligible for educational support through the VA, and I give you my word, we'll make sure you're never left without help again. Alicia covered her mouth with both hands as tears spilled freely down her cheeks. Her voice trembled as she turned to Jesse, barely able to speak. We're not alone anymore. But Jesse remained still. He looked down at the bronze star, then over at the soldier who still stood saluting him, then slowly turned to see his daughter, tiny, silent, clutching her brother's hand near the bunkhouse door. His voice, when it came, was barely a whisper, raw with disbelief and memory. I thought I was forgotten. Daniel stepped quietly to his side. His voice was low but firm, steady like the winter earth beneath him. You were never forgotten. You were just waiting to be found. The general reached out and with deliberate hands pinned the bronze star onto Jesse's jacket, right over his heart. The fabric was worn, faded by years and hardship, but in that moment, it bore a weight of honor it hadn't known in decades. Everything around them seemed to still. The wind dropped, the falling snow paused midair, as if holding its breath. And for the first time in years, Jesse Turner didn't stand as a shadow of a past war. He stood as a soldier acknowledged, as a man fully seen, not surrounded by whispers of shame or pity, but by the quiet dignity of justice. The noise of the arriving convoy hadn't gone unnoticed. The commotion had drawn more than just eyes. It stirred something dormant in the town. By the time the final crate was unloaded, pickup trucks began to appear one by one along the edge of Daniel Clayton's fence line. Some waited, hesitant, engines rumbling and idle. Others pulled fully onto the property, tires crunching over gravel. These were neighbors who had once kept their distance, who had only ever nodded from porches or passed with tight smiles at the store. Now they stood shoulder to shoulder in the snow, their presence a quiet mixture of curiosity, guilt, and something else. Pride, perhaps, or shame softened by the first hint of redemption. Frank Cooper, Daniel's old friend, and perhaps Jesse's most outspoken critic, was the first to approach. Slowly, almost awkwardly, he took off his hat as he came near, his eyes downcast, his boots heavy with more than snow. His gaze moved across the rows of soldiers, the crates of supplies, and finally settled on Jesse, who stood silent beside his family, the star still gleaming on his coat. I didn't know, Frank muttered, clearing his throat roughly. Didn't know you were one of them. Jesse looked at him with a calm, unreadable expression. One of who, a soldier? Frank hesitated. A good one. Daniel stepped forward, his voice steady. He's also a husband, a father, a man who never asked for anything and gave more than most ever do. There was no sarcasm in Frank now, just the quiet weight of realization pressing against old judgments. One by one, others joined. The gas station clerk who once turned away. The waitress from the diner who had looked through Alicia like she didn't exist while she stood outside in the cold, cradling her baby. Now they came not with explanations, but with gestures. Thermoses of steaming soup, folded blankets, soft apologies that needed no words. They came with their discomfort, their remorse, their slow rediscovery of grace. Rebecca, Daniel's daughter, stood near the porch, watching it all unfold. She wiped at her eyes once, then stepped off the stoop and crossed to Alicia, kneeling to help unpack baby formula from one of the crates. Her movements were quiet, purposeful, not for show, just for healing. Michael, Rebecca's brother, approached Jesse with a nod of respect that needed no flourish. "You staying here a while?" "Just till I can get the van running," Jesse replied. "No rush," Michael said, as if surprised by the softness in his own voice. The general turned to Daniel with the kind of look that passed between soldiers who didn't need to explain things out loud. "You've always led from the front," he said. Daniel gave a modest shrug. "Didn't do anything special." "You did more than most," the general replied. "You reminded them of who they are." And that was the truth. In a town that had grown cold, not from winter but from forgetting, someone had finally struck a spark. The cold didn't come only from the weather. It came from the weight of being forgotten, of wondering whether anything still mattered. But a single act of quiet compassion had sparked something they thought they'd lost for good. As the sun dipped low behind the hills and the last light stretched long over the frozen land, the ranch stopped being just Daniel's. It became something more, a place to reckon with the past and rediscover the meaning of home. In the weeks that followed, a rhythm slowly returned to the Clayton Ranch, a rhythm that hadn't been heard in years, not since Margaret's passing. Each morning, well before the sky lightened, Jesse was already outside, clearing snow from the driveway, feeding the livestock, and mending fences left to weather with time and grief. He didn't move with reluctance or obligation. He worked with the quiet drive of someone trying to repair more than a house. It was as though each nail he hammered, each board he fixed, helped to heal something broken inside himself. Daniel sat on the porch most mornings, his breath a mist in the freezing air, watching Jesse from a distance. It wasn't that he couldn't do the work himself, but something inside him knew it was time to let someone else shoulder the burden. And Jesse, with his quiet persistence, took it on without complaint. The bunkhouse, once left to rot in silence, now echoed with life again. Emma helped Alicia with the laundry, proudly learning to master the old wood stove, her cheeks flushed with pride. Thomas stuck to Daniel like a loyal pup, asking endless questions about sheep births and hay storage, his chatter filling the quiet that had haunted the fields for too long. Even baby Grace had changed. Her persistent cough had quieted, and now she laughed, full and unexpected, a sound no one dared hope for during those hard first nights. In the dead of winter, Jesse managed to find a part-time job in town with a local contractor. The pay wasn't much, barely enough for gas, but it brought back something more valuable, a sense of dignity. Alicia began baking again, filling the kitchen with smells of cinnamon and fruit, and offered her pies to neighbors who once judged her from across grocery aisles. No one turned her away now. Bit by bit, the land responded to their efforts, as if it too had been waiting for someone to care again. Jesse reinforced sagging beams on the roof. Together, he and Daniel dug fresh irrigation lines where the fields had grown dry and brittle. Slowly, the earth softened, and so did the people. One crisp Saturday afternoon, Daniel and Jesse sat side by side on the porch, two steaming mugs of coffee in hand. In front of the bunkhouse, the kids worked together to build a snowman. Emma proudly wrapped a scarf around its neck, while Thomas insisted loudly that it needed boots to be proper. Their laughter carried across the white field. Jesse took a sip, then stared down into his cup. "I keep thinking about that first night I knocked on your door." Daniel didn't look at him. "What about it?" "You didn't hesitate," Jesse said. "Didn't know me. Had no reason to trust me, but you did." Daniel let the words hang in the air a moment, then exhaled slowly, a visible cloud curling from his lips. "You ever been so far down that one stranger's kindness feels like a breath of air after drowning?" Jesse nodded, his throat tightening. Daniel's voice softened, worn by time and memory. "Back in '93, I broke down just outside Cheyenne. VA check was late. My wife and the kids were into the car, and I stood there at a gas station, empty inside, feeling like the whole world had forgotten I ever mattered. Then this old woman came up, handed me $10. No questions. Just said, 'Someone did it for me once. You'll do it for someone else. Jesse met his eyes. And now you did. Daniel shook his head, watching the kids tumble in the snow. No, now we did. And in that quiet moment, simple, cold, and edged with frost, two veterans, separated by years but shaped by the same war-scarred path, understood something few others ever would. Service didn't end with a uniform folded in a trunk. It didn't end with the last salute or the final roll call. It lived on, carried in the small things. In the fences repaired, the children kept warm, the strangers who became family. Heroism didn't always wear medals or march in parades. Sometimes it sat quietly on a weathered porch, sharing coffee while snow fell on a ranch few people remembered. It happened in silence, in out-of-the-way places where pain and pride lived side by side. Daniel Clayton never led armies. He didn't save a nation, but he opened a door when no one else would. And in that single gesture, he reminded not just Jesse Turner, but a whole community of what service truly meant. Service isn't always loud. It's not the stuff of headlines or speeches. Sometimes it's a man giving his last $10 with nothing expected in return. Sometimes it's the quiet yes spoken when the world only gives no. And sometimes it's the chance offered to someone who's been bent for years by shame, by silence, by a world too distracted to care, giving him the space to stand tall again. Jesse Turner didn't want pity. What he needed was a place to land, a space where he wasn't seen as a failure, but as a man who had stumbled and still stood, a man who had given and had more still to give. And Daniel's quiet, unshaking courage gave him that. The snow would eventually melt. The children would return to school. The old van got fixed. But something had shifted, not just for Jesse, not just for Daniel, but for everyone who had watched them and remembered. Long after the last military vehicle rolled away and the soldiers disappeared back into their routines, something else lingered in the air over that quiet patch of land. A different kind of banner had been raised, one that didn't snap in the wind or carry the weight of command. This one was woven with threads of redemption, of dignity reclaimed, and of the unspoken truth that real honor isn't pinned to a chest or earned in battle. It's revealed in the quiet, daily choices we make to see each other, to help without applause, and to show up when it's uncomfortable. In a world that races forward, where people hurry past suffering without a second glance, it's easy to believe that someone else's struggle isn't our concern. We convince ourselves that someone else will step in, that it's not our problem. But what happened between an aging rancher and a man discarded by life tells a different story. One that reminds us that doing what's right doesn't need a spotlight. It rarely draws attention, but it always leaves a mark. Daniel Clayton didn't have much to offer: a quiet home, a stretch of weathered land, and a daily rhythm shaped by seasons and silence. Jesse Turner had even less, just a broken spirit and a faded uniform that had once meant something. What unfolded between them wasn't dramatic or loud, but it was real, something rare. Through their quiet actions, dignity was returned to a man who had lost everything. Trust, long buried under scars, was slowly unearthed. And the town around them? It caught a glimpse of what it used to be, what it still could be. So maybe this isn't a story that asks, what would you have done? Maybe the better question is, who around you is waiting for someone to believe in them again? A neighbor living behind a broken fence, a veteran with tired eyes at the grocery store, a family member who's drifted too far away. We all pass them. We all feel the tug. Some of us stop. Have you ever stepped in when no one else would? Or maybe you've been the one silently hoping someone would notice. If so, you already understand. Compassion isn't a weakness. It's a strength earned from walking through life's storms and choosing kindness anyway. Thank you for reading. Thank you for holding space for stories that matter, not because they're loud, but because they're true. The world doesn't need more heroes in uniforms or people with grand titles. Sometimes the strongest among us are those who simply choose to care, when it's inconvenient, when no one else does, and when it counts the most. And if this story stirred something in you, hold on to it. Share it with someone who still believes that quiet goodness can change the world. Because real kindness, steady, sincere, and without condition, never goes out of style.